I usually find it's helpful to make a contrast between punitive justice and restorative justice. In punitive justice, the assumption that we have, which is a dominant paradigm in the United States, and I think maybe here as well, is that when somebody violates a rule or a law, then they need to be punished. And our hope is that when we punish them, they'll act better or something like that. Restorative justice, in contrast, says that when a rule or law has been violated, somebody's been affected by that. The reason we create our rules and laws is to try to create a more fair relationship, a more fair arrangement for us to live together. So when a rule or law has been violated, then that relationship has been disturbed in some way. And so restorative justice then focuses on that, not on the law. The law points us to that, but now we focus on what is the underlying, what happened and what is the relationship. And so then the focus of restorative justice then, once we get the right people together, then the question is sort of, how do we recognize what happened? How do we work at restoring equity as much as possible? And how do we clarify the future? And then what kind of arrangements do we make so that those agreements, we know that those agreements are being kept? And when that happens, then trust grows. And we have a very different ending to that situation rather than simply punishing someone. Yeah, some of my experience related to this actually started with the establishing the victim offender reconciliation program in Fresno, California, in the United States. I did that after I had seen it begin in Elkhart, Indiana, where Howard Zare and Earl Sears were sort of starting this first VORP program there. And so when I moved to California, I, by that time, was convinced that every community should have that option, because our criminal justice system normally did not provide the option of people being able to get the victim and offender together. And so we gathered people in Fresno, and they eventually said, yes, let's do that. And so they asked me if I would help get that started, and I said, sure, I'd be glad to help get it started. And you know, it's now 40 years later, and I'm still working at getting it started, but I think we have made some progress there. And so what we did is the very first cases, we were given some experimental cases that by the probation department with juvenile offenders. And the very first case had to do with a bicycle that had been stolen, and when I met with the offender, I'd been told that the offender and his parents probably would not participate in this kind of thing, that they had children that had been in trouble with the law before and so on. But when I met with them and described what they could do, they were very interested. And the idea of meeting with the victim and trying to repair things with the victim. And so when I met with the victim was also willing. And so when we came together, the offender described that he had been walking by. He knew that this bicycle, this boy had a new bicycle. So he said, I went in the backyard, took it, and then I took off some of the parts to try to disguise it, but I got caught. So now the mother of the boy whose bicycle it was said, can I speak? And she said, my experience was that you didn't just come in the backyard, you came to right up by the patio door, which is almost like entering our house. And each of our children gets only one new bicycle. And this was shortly after Christmas. He had gotten this new bicycle for Christmas. She said, I got extra work in order to earn the money to buy this bicycle. And it just doesn't seem fair that you can just come and take it and take the parts. Well, the offender was very moved by listening to this experience and as well as the offender's mother. And so they wanted to talk a little bit alone. because the next thing we were going to do is to talk about how do we repair some of this and how do we go on the future. So they met alone a little bit, came back and said, well, my son he'll be working with his uncle. And he said, my uncle will give me some work and he'll take my earning and he will send that to the victim or to the VORP program so that you can give it to the victim so that we can get that repaid. And so we need to have a good estimate of what it would cost to get the bicycle repaired to new condition again. And so that was what they agreed on there. When I asked them about what about in the future, because they were at the same school, and the offender at that point just very clearly volunteered. I was the one at fault here. If there's anybody gives you some trouble related to your having turned me in and my getting caught, he says, let me know because I will talk to them and I will make sure that they. So they had, and they were pretty clear that they could meet on the school campus without having ongoing difficulty between them. So a very different ending to a criminal event than what usually happens when you simply separate and put them in prison. So we have worked in our VORP program since we started it in 1982 with more than 15,000 cases like that, and some much more serious and some not as serious even as that, and but a large number of cases. And we find that when you invite offenders, they're usually willing. Not everyone, but most, almost all are. And most victims are also willing when they understand how it's going to work. And a researcher from Berkeley, from the University of California in Berkeley, did a significant study and evaluation of our program, of the CJC program. And so those were the first statistics that we had that were really done by somebody outside. We knew we had very good statistics, but when we say it, then it's like, well, of course you think they're, yeah. But so it needed to be some outside entity looking at it. And these are, it's available on our website to see the full, the full report. But they looked at recidivism, sort of repeating offenses, at restitution to victims, and cost to the system, to cost of the case. And so they did comparisons then between if they participated in a CJC or they didn't participate in the C, and did comparison. So in the juvenile side, on the recidivism, and I don't have those numbers right in front of me, so, but these are close. It was like the recidivism for non-CJC was 20-some%, but those that participated in the CJC was something like 5%. So a significant reduction in those who repeat the offense. In terms of the restitution that's paid to victims, when I first started into this, I just thought if the judge ordered it, it had to be paid. But what we've realized and what the statistics showed is that in our jurisdiction there, it's less than 10% that actually gets paid when the judge orders restitution, according to the statistics here. But when they participate in a CJC or a community justice conference, it's over 90% now. It was, I think the first 5 years it was in the 80% or something like that, but it's actually gone up since then. And then the cost. When you consider the cost of the judge, the prosecutor, the defense, the VORP, or our own people working with it, and probation, when you take all those costs together, the cost for a CJC case, juvenile case, is about $1,200, $1,200. When you don't do it through a CJC process, and then the cost is about $9,000. And if in the regular process they incarcerate or the young person, then it jumps to over 100,000. So it's very clear that not only does this provide a better outcome for the victim, it's also better for the offender because they're less likely to repeat, and it also costs less. So it seems to me that it should be quickly embraced to include more cases, but we're very slow at including more cases. That punitive paradigm, that idea that people have to be punished, is deep, deep within our system, but also within our families, within our structures, organizations, grievance processes, and so on. So making this shift, even though the statistics are very clear that there would be a value in doing that, it's still hard. A punitive structure means that we're going to finally, we're going to rely on punishment. A restorative structure says we're going to find a restorative way, one that is respectful for everyone, one that is reasonable, one that really is intended to restore, and it's evaluated and it's intended to reintegrate, as opposed to, it doesn't seem reasonable, it doesn't seem respectful, it really is intended to hurt, which is what punishment is about, and it's intended to separate people. So if it's doing those things, it's not restorative. If it's bringing people together in a respectful way and so on, then and so we have to evaluate, I think, the ideas of what we're doing. So often what I think is hoped for is that restorative justice can be a little add-on to a punitive system, and it can simply give us a nicer way to punish. And I don't think that's what it's about. I think it's about replacing a punitive system with a restorative system, where we actually begin to believe that we can create a structure that is based on restoration rather than punishment. In our VOR program for training, we train volunteers who did most of the mediation. I should say now in this CJC program, we are employing graduate students who are studying peacemaking and conflict studies at our university there. For the volunteers, we would have a 9-hour training, which we started out I think we wanted to have 5 or 6 days or whatever, but what we were trying to do is find what's the minimum amount of training that a person needs in order to do a good, respectable job in providing being the facilitator, the mediator for a VORP case. And so in 9 hours. So the focus there is on helping them understand sort of this idea of restorative justice, and then on how you meet with the offender to prepare the offender, and to be sure you're asking for, are they really willing to cooperate with this? If they feel the safety in bringing in a victim and offender together, which I think for many people, when they first hear it, thinks that's a very volatile kind of a situation. But if you prepare people adequately, it's not at all volatile. We've 15,000 cases. We've never had a case that turned into a fight or something like that. It's always because of the preparation. And so the critical first step is that the offender actually, once they hear about how it's going to work, they actually say, yes, I accept responsibility for what I did, which may be a little different than what they were charged with in a legal, but they're willing to accept responsibility for what they did, and they're willing to work at that in some kind of a constructive way together with the victim. And they're doing that voluntarily. They're not saying, well, I have no choice, or it's really, they do have choices, and we make sure that they understand they have choices, and this has to be something they've chosen. And because then if it does become a little bit volatile in the meeting, then you can go back and say, you said you wanted to do this, do you still want to do this? And that's very helpful to have that. And if the offender is willing, then we also talk to the victim. We usually don't talk to the victim first because we don't want the victim to sort of agonize on whether or not they want to do this, and make that decision and find out that the offender is not willing to accept responsibility, because then we feel we would be victimizing the victim again. So we usually, when we go to the victim, we already know that the offender is willing to accept responsibility. And the offender understands that the victim might not be willing. And if they're not willing, then we could possibly find a surrogate victim, or we can find another way to do a meeting. But our preference is to do it with the actual victim. So then we invite the victim again. And these are broad numbers, but it's probably 95% of the offenders that are willing, and it's more than 80% of the victims that are willing.